The land remembers what we forget, and the soil holds the heavy weight of seasons long after the crops are harvested and the fields are left fallow for the winter months. In our valley, time does not move in minutes or hours, but in the slow deepening of the shadows across the eastern ridge and the steady rot of the old oak fence posts that my father drove into the earth. When Mary passed away in the late autumn of that cold year, a silence settled over the neighboring farm that felt less like an absence and more like a heavy physical presence that sat on the porch and leaned against the white clapboard walls and looked out over the overgrown rows of the apple orchard. Thomas was a man built from the same limestone and hard clay as the hills themselves, a person who did not know how to ask for comfort and would rather break his own fingers before he ever admitted that the world had grown too quiet for his liking. I watched him from my kitchen window for 3 months as he moved through his morning chores with a steady, mechanical precision. His shoulders hunched against the biting wind, and his old blue cap pulled down low over his eyes as he carried water to the livestock and chopped wood until the stack was higher than the eaves of his shed. It was on a Tuesday in late July when the blackberries were finally ripe enough to stain your fingers purple just by touching them that I decided to bake the first pie. The kitchen was thick with the scent of bubbling sugar and sour rhubarb, and the heat from the oven made the air dance above the stovetop while I crimped the edges of the dough with the back of a silver fork that had belonged to my grandmother. I wrapped the dish in a clean dishcloth, and I walked across the gravel road that separated our lives, the dust rising in small puffs around my boots as the afternoon heat beat down on the back of my neck. Thomas was standing by his workbench in the barn, his hands black with engine grease and his face shadowed by the timber beams above him as he worked on an old cultivator that had given up the ghost. He did not look up when my shadow fell across the threshold, but his movements slowed just enough for me to know he knew I was there. I placed the pie down on the scarred wood of his bench right next to a box of rusted pins, and for a long moment, the only sound was the dry hum of the cicadas in the grass outside. He looked at the pie, and then he looked at me, his gray eyes searching my face with a quiet, stubborn intensity that felt like a question he couldn't quite bring himself to formulate. He wiped his palms on a rag that was as worn as his expression, and he cleared his throat, the sound rough and raspy like boot leather on gravel. "If I were 20 years younger, Clara," he said, his voice carrying a dry, ironic tilt that didn't quite hide the weight behind it, "I'd marry you right now and spend the rest of my days making sure you never had to bake another crust for anyone else." It was a joke, spoken with the polite distance of an old neighbor who knew the boundaries of the valley, but the words hung in the air between us like the dust motes caught in the shafts of afternoon sunlight. I didn't laugh, because laughing would have meant acknowledging the spaces between us that neither of us had the right to cross, so I simply nodded and told him to eat it before the crust went soggy from the fruit juice. That was the beginning of an unspoken arrangement that grew between us like the wild ivy that climbed up the eastern side of his silo, a slow and deliberate braiding of 2 lives that had both been emptied out by the passage of time. Thomas was not a man for grand gestures or performative displays of gratitude, but the next morning I found my woodpile stacked 3 feet higher than I had left it. The oak logs split so cleanly that the grain looked like polished stone in the morning light. We began a routine that was as rhythmic as the turning of the earth, a series of small, practical interactions that carried more weight than any sermon delivered from the pulpit of the Methodist church town. He would come over on Thursdays to check the belts on my well pump, and he would tell me that the grease fitting was dry, and I would tell him that he was using the wrong wrench, and we would argue for 20 minutes about the thread count of a bolt until the sun went down behind the ridge. These arguments were not born from hostility or anger, but were a kind of intellectual intimacy, a way for 2 stubborn people to look each other in the eye and say that they mattered enough to disagree with. He possessed a profound competence that made him seem like an extension of the machines he repaired, a stoic dignity that didn't allow him to complain when his knees stiffened up in the damp weather or when the price of feed went up another $1 a bushel. I would watch him from my porch as he mended the boundary fence between our pastures, his movements deliberate and unhurried as he stretched the barbed wire with a come-along tool and nailed the staples into the cedar posts with 3 clean strokes of his hammer. He never looked up to see if I was watching, but he always left the gate unlatched just enough so that I could walk through without having to lift the heavy iron latch myself. My own life had become a series of quiet rooms and long afternoons spent working on quilts that no one was waiting to buy. the needle slipping through the cotton layers with a soft, rhythmic click that filled the silence of the house. Bringing him those pies and those jars of pickled beets was not an act of charity, but a way to anchor myself to something real, something that had a heartbeat and a stubborn refusal to break under the pressure of the years. We were both survivors of a particular kind of quiet devastation, the kind that doesn't make the newspapers but leaves a permanent frost on the inside of your windows during the winter months. When the autumn came and the leaves turned the color of old copper and spilled down into the ditches along the county road, the air took on a sharp, metallic edge that made your lungs ache if you breathed too deeply. The landscape changed from the lush green of summer to a stark, skeletal version of itself, exposing the bare bones of the earth and the gray limestone ledges that ran like scars across the face of the valley. Thomas began spending more time in his woodshop, the blue smoke from his chimney curling up against the gray sky like a signal fire from a distant island. I baked a pear and ginger pie when the first frost killed off the tomato vines, the fruit harvested from the old tree behind my shed that had survived 3 separate lightning strikes and still managed to bear sugar-sweet fruit every September. When I carried it across the road, the grass crunched under my boots like broken glass, and the wind caught the hem of my woolen coat, whipping it against my legs with a sound like a snapping sail. He opened the kitchen door before I could even knock, standing there in his flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his forearms thick and hairy and dusted with white pine sawdust from the bowls he was turning on his lathe. He took the dish from my hands with a nod that was short and definitive, his fingers brushing against mine for a brief second, his skin hot and rough like sandstone that had been sitting in the sun. "Come inside out of the chill, Clara," he said, stepping back to let me into the kitchen that still smelled of Mary's lavender soap and 30 years of wood smoke. The kitchen was immaculately clean but completely devoid of life. The table cleared of everything except a single salt shaker and an old almanac with a dog-eared cover. I sat on the edge of the wooden chair while he cut 2 thick wedges of the pie, his hands steady despite the tremor that had started showing up in his left thumb when the weather turned cold. We ate in a silence that was comfortable and heavy, the only sound being the ticking of the regulator clock on the wall and the occasional rattle of the window panes as the north wind hit the side of the house. He finished his piece and wiped his mustache with the back of his hand, his eyes tracking the way the gray winter light fell across my fingers. "If I were 20 years younger, Clara," he said again, the repetition of the phrase sounding like a familiar melody played on an old piano with 2 sticky keys, "I'd take you down to the courthouse before the snow sets in and make sure you never had to spend a winter night alone in that big house of yours." I looked at him, noting the deep lines carved around his mouth and the silver that had completely taken over the hair at his temples, and I felt a strange, tight knot form in the center of my chest. "You're not 20 years younger, Thomas," I said, my voice short and punchy, and the snow was already starting to fall on the ridge. The winter that followed was the longest the valley had seen in 3 decades. A brutal, white expanse of days where the thermometer froze at 0 and the drifts piled up as high as the windowsills of the milking parlor. The world shrank down to the radius of the wood stove and the small patch of floor where the heat was strong enough to keep your tea from growing cold before you could finish the cup. From my window, I could see his house sitting like a dark ship locked in an ocean of ice, the windows dark during the day and glowing with a dim, yellow kerosene light when the long nights closed in at 4 in the afternoon. We didn't see each other for weeks at a time, but we communicated through the landscape itself, using the snow as a canvas for our quiet, practical support. Every morning after a heavy snowfall, I would hear the low, rumbling growl of his old tractor clearing the road between our properties, the iron blade scraping against the gravel with a sound that felt like a reassurance. He would plow right up to my back porch, leaving a clean path through the drifts, but he would never stop the engine or come inside for a cup of coffee. He would simply lift the blade, turn the tractor around, and rumble back across the road to his own frozen yard. In return, I would wait until he went out to check his beef cattle in the afternoon, and then I would wrap a hot jar of beef stew and 3 thick slices of rye bread in a wool blanket and leave it on his back step. It was a silent conversation carried out in the sub-zero air, a way of checking each other's pulse without having to ask the questions that neither of us wanted to answer. One evening, when the wind was howling through the eaves and the rafters were groaning under the weight of the snow, I found myself thinking about his hands and the way they had looked when he took the pie from me in the autumn. There was a profound stubbornness in the way he refused to let the winter beat him, a quiet dignity that I found myself respecting more than any quality I had ever encountered in another human being. He was a man who had lost the centerpiece of his life when Mary died, yet he did not let the grief turn into rot. Instead, he turned it into a hard, protective shell that kept him moving forward through the drifts day after day. I realized then that the tension between us wasn't about what had been said or what hadn't been said, but about the sheer weight of our independent survival. Two old trees with deep roots holding onto the same hillside while the storm raged around them. When the spring finally broke through the frost in late April, the valley turned into a muddy, roaring torrent of melted snow and rushing creeks that tore out the culverts along the lower road. The smell of wet earth and decaying leaves was thick in the morning air, a primal, heavy scent that promised life even as it exposed the wreckage that the winter had left behind. It was during this time of renewal, when the world was shaking off its white shroud and the first green shoots of wild mustard were showing up in the ditches, that the rhythm of our lives returned to its familiar track. I was sitting on my porch one afternoon, watching the sun hit the muddy water in the creek, when I realized how far this story had traveled from that first blackberry pie in the heat of summer. Before we go any further into the turning of the seasons and the choices that changed everything for us, I want to take a moment to ask all of you who are listening where you are watching this from today. Please leave a comment below with your city or town, because it always amazes me to think about how these stories of our quiet valley can reach across the distances to find people sitting in their own kitchens or living rooms thousands of miles away. It helps remind me that no matter how isolated we might feel in our own small corners of the world, there is always a thread that connects us if we are willing to look for it. Now, as the mud began to dry and the roads became passable again, the true test of that connection arrived with the suddenness of a summer storm that came 3 months ahead of its time. It was a Tuesday evening when the sky turned the color of an old bruise, a deep, greenish black that made the birds go dead silent in the trees and caused the cattle to crowd into the corners of the pastures with their heads down against the rising wind. The barometer dropped so fast it made my ears pop, and within 20 minutes, the wind was screaming through the valley with a fury that I hadn't felt since I was a young girl. I stood by my kitchen window and watched as the first heavy drops of rain slammed against the glass, followed immediately by a barrage of hail that sounded like a handful of gravel being thrown against the side of the house over and over again. Through the sheet of gray water, I saw a flash of lightning split the sky, and in that brief, brilliant instant, I saw the roof of Thomas's old hay barn lift up and tear away like a piece of paper caught in a campfire draft. The sound of the timber ripping apart was lost in the roar of the wind, but I didn't need to hear it to know what it meant for a man whose entire livelihood depended on the dry storage of his winter feed. Without thinking about the lightning or the mud, I pulled on my yellow oilskin slicker and grabbed my heavy flashlight, running out into the storm with the rain blinding my eyes. The gravel road had turned into a shallow river of red clay and stone, the water swirling around my ankles as I forced my way across to his yard. When I reached the barn, I found Thomas standing in the ruins of the structure, the rain soaking through his shirt and plastering his white hair to his forehead as he tried to drag a heavy canvas tarp over the exposed bales of Timothy hay. He was working with a desperate, furious energy that was terrifying to behold, his muscles straining against the weight of the wet canvas and his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps that could be heard even over the storm. I grabbed the other corner of the tarp and pulled with everything I had, digging my boots into the slick mud and using my weight to anchor the canvas against the wind that was trying to rip it from our hands. He looked up and saw me, his eyes wide with a mixture of anger and shock, his mouth opening to tell me to go back inside where it was safe. I didn't give him the chance to speak. I simply yelled at him to shut up and hold the beam while I secured the rope around the iron eyelets of the foundation. We worked for 2 hours in the pouring rain, an old man and an old woman fighting the elements with nothing but rope and canvas and sheer, unadulterated stubbornness. When the wind finally began to die down into a steady, miserable drizzle, the hay was covered and the main structure was stabilized, though the western wall was leaning sharply. We stood inside the dry part of the barn, dripping water onto the floorboards, our chests heaving as we tried to catch our breath in the dark. Thomas leaned against a support post, his head tilted back against the wood, his eyes closed as the adrenaline began to fade from his system, leaving him looking older and more fragile than I had ever seen him. "This barn was built by my grandfather in 1912, he said, his voice quiet and subtext heavy, and it's lasted through 3 tornadoes and a fire, but the wood is just tired, Clara." I walked over to him and put my hand on his arm, feeling the cold rain on his skin and the steady, heavy thud of his heart underneath the wet flannel. "The wood isn't the only thing that's tired, Thomas," I said, framing the argument not as hostility but as an intellectual intimacy that forced him to look at his own limits. "You can't keep fighting this valley by yourself, and you're too stubborn to admit that you need someone to hold the other side of the rope." He opened his eyes and looked down at my hand on his arm, his expression softening into something that wasn't quite a smile but carried the same warmth as a wood stove when the fire has burned down to the coals. He didn't pull away, and for the first time in the 2 years since Mary had passed, the silence between us didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a door that had been left unlatched by accident. That night marked the shift in our dynamic, a quiet but pivotal character decision where we stopped pretending that we were just 2 neighbors who happened to live across the road from one another. The next Sunday, I didn't leave the pie on his porch. I knocked on the door and walked right into his kitchen, carrying a hot apple and cinnamon pie that had just come out of the oven. He was sitting at the table with a pot of black coffee already brewed, 2 mugs waiting on the clean oilcloth instead of the single one he usually used. We sat down together, and as he cut the slices, he looked at the crimped edge of the crust and then looked up at me with a slow, deliberate nod. "This looks exactly like the one you brought over 2 summers ago when the cultivator broke down," he observed, his voice carrying a rhythmic cadence that felt like a callback to the beginning of our long dance. "It is the same recipe," I replied, taking my mug and blowing on the hot coffee, "because some things don't need to be changed just because the calendar pages turn over." We ate our pie and we talked about the cost of oak timber for the barn repair, and we discussed the weather reports for the coming month, our dialogue sparse but heavy with the subtext of everything we weren't saying out loud. There were no grand declarations of love or performative promises of eternal devotion, but every word we spoke was a commitment to the practical support of each other's lives. He told me that my chimney cap was loose and needed to be re-mortared before the fall rains came, and I told him that his winter coats were missing 2 buttons on the cuffs and that he should bring them over so I could fix them properly. This was our banter, polite but pointed, a way of communicating affection through the language of chores and maintenance that both of us understood better than any romantic poetry. The landscape outside was turning green again, the pastures filling out with thick clover and the apple trees in his orchard bursting into white blossoms that smelled of honey and old paper. As the afternoon sun shifted across the kitchen floor, casting long shadows that touched our boots, I realized that the tension that had sustained us through the long winter had finally resolved into a steady, comfortable presence that didn't need to be justified by the past. By the time the summer heat returned to the valley, the routine of our separate households had completely dissolved into a single, shared existence that felt as natural as the changing of the leaves. We still maintained our own houses, but the doors were never locked, and the path across the gravel road had been worn down into a clean, smooth strip of earth where no grass could grow. Thomas had rebuilt the western wall of his barn with the help of a couple of young men from town, but he had insisted that I be the one to drive the final iron spike into the main header beam, a practical gesture that served as his own quiet way of acknowledging that the building belonged to both of us now. We were sitting on his porch one evening in late August, watching the fireflies rise out of the tall grass like sparks from a chimney, when the old joke made its final appearance. The air was heavy with the scent of the evening primrose and the distant sound of a tractor working the bottom land 2 miles away, a peaceful, grounded moment that felt like a reward for all the winters we had survived. I had brought over a peach cobbler this time, the fruit sweet and sticky and still bubbling in the cast iron skillet I had baked it in. Thomas finished his portion and set the plate down on the wooden floorboards, his long legs stretched out in front of him and his hands laced together over his stomach. He looked out over the fields that he had worked for 50 years, his face silhouetted against the purple twilight, and he cleared his throat with that same raspy sound that I had grown to love. "Clara," he said, his voice dropping into a register that was earnest and heavy with a quiet drama. "I've been thinking about what I've been telling you these past 2 years about being 20 years younger." I didn't say anything. I just waited, my heart giving a short, sudden thud against my ribs as I watched his profile in the darkening light. "I was wrong about that," he continued, turning his head to look at me, his gray eyes steady and completely devoid of the irony that usually accompanied the words. "I don't need to be 20 years younger to know that the best part of my life is standing right here in front of me, and I don't want to waste whatever time the Lord has left for us waiting for a past that isn't coming back." It wasn't a grand, performative declaration, but a simple, definitive statement of fact that carried the entire weight of his stoic dignity. I looked at his hands, rough and scarred and capable of mending everything except the passage of time, and I reached out and put my palms over his. "You're exactly the age you need to be, Thomas," I said, my voice short and definitive, "and I've already mended your winter coats for the coming year." The epilogue of a life spent together in the valley does not move with the frantic speed of the world outside, but unfolds with the slow, majestic progression of decades that pass over the hills like clouds on a summer afternoon. We were married on a quiet Saturday in September, not in the big church town with a crowd of onlookers, but right there on the porch of his house with the preacher and 2 neighbors standing as witnesses in the afternoon light. The world around us changed in ways that felt distant and unimportant. The dirt road was finally paved with black asphalt, and the old telephone lines were replaced by invisible signals that flew through the air. But inside our fence lines, the rhythm remained anchored to the soil and the seasons. We spent 15 years sharing that kitchen table, 15 winters where the tractor cleared the driveway and the jars of hot stew were eaten together by the warmth of the wood stove instead of being left on a cold back step. Thomas grew older with the same stubborn dignity that had defined his youth, his hair turning a brilliant, snowy white and his steps becoming slower and more deliberate as his knees gave way to the damp autumn chills. He never complained about the pain or the stiffness, but he allowed me to help him up the porch steps when the day was done, his hand resting on my shoulder with a weight that felt like an honor rather than a burden. We continued our polite, pointed banter until the very end, arguing about the best time to plant the potatoes or whether the weather report was lying about the chances of rain, using those small disagreements as a form of intellectual intimacy that kept our minds sharp and our hearts connected. He still looked at me with those same intense gray eyes every time I baked a pie, though he never made the joke about being 20 years younger again. Instead, he would simply take my hand and press his dry, wrinkled lips to my knuckles with a quiet reverence that didn't need any words to explain it. We watched the apple orchard grow old and gnarly, its branches bending down to touch the ground under the weight of the fruit, a living metaphor for our own long endurance on this piece of earth. We had sacrificed the easy comfort of an untroubled isolation for the heavy, complicated joy of a shared life, and as I looked back over those years, I knew that every storm we had fought in the mud had been worth the shelter we had built together. When Thomas finally passed away in his sleep during a quiet night in the middle of a gentle spring rain, he did so with the same lack of theater that had characterized his entire existence, leaving the world as quietly as a shadow slipping across the pasture at dusk. I found him with his hands resting peacefully on his chest, his face smooth and free of the lines of worry and age that he had carried for so long, looking like a man who had finished his chores and had finally earned his rest. The silence that returned to the house was different this time. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of grief that had lived here after Mary died, but a warm, resonant quietness that was filled with the echoes of 15 years of shared meals and soft laughter and rhythmic conversations. I buried him on the knoll behind the barn, right next to the big oak tree where the shade stays cool even in the dead of July, where he could look out over the valley he had plowed and mended for his entire life. As I stand here on the porch today, looking out at the gravel path that is now grown over with green grass and wild clover, I am reminded that love is not something that belongs only to the young or the unburdened. It is a prize that is earned through endurance, through the willingness to stand in the pouring rain and hold the other side of the canvas when the wind is trying to tear everything apart. To all of you who have stayed with me through this long journey across the seasons of our valley, I want to say thank you for listening to a story that is as simple as a pie crust and as old as the hills themselves. I hope that wherever you are watching from today, you find the strength to look across the road that separates you from someone else, and that you have the stubbornness to build a bridge, even when the time seems too short and the years seem too heavy. Life does not give us guarantees of more time or younger bodies, but it gives us the choice to offer what we have to the people who are willing to stand beside us in the storm. Take care of yourselves out there, and remember that sometimes the most important thing you can do for another human being is simply to bake the pie, walk across the road, and be ready to hold the rope when the wind starts to blow.